Good morning. A few more people to show up. Any questions or anything going on we need to ask or want to ask each other? Looks like a Wednesday, like Monday. Well, since we have most folks here, I can't strongly recommend enough if you get a chance. It's in the bibliography thing, A Native Planters of Old Hawaii. It was written by Handy in the 1930s. I'm not sure who Handy was. He was obviously a botanist, but I don't know if it was actually his career or whether he just did this like a hobby. But in the 1930s, he went to all the different parts of the islands, interviewed a ton of farmers and stuff like that, and basically wrote this enormous 660-page text. The first part looks at every Hawaiian crop in the sense of useful plants the Hawaiian use. So the book breaks down into two parts. The first part is which of these plants were used for, how you grow them. In other words, everything you need to know if you were a farmer. And it's still the only real comprehensive text we have. The last half is basically looking at every part of every island in terms of what they grew there and how they grew it. So this makes it an absolutely incredible resource because we don't, by the time he was writing this up, most of the traditional Hawaiian agriculture was gone. And most importantly, what was happening is people had moved away from growing Hawaiian crops to growing introduced stuff. So for example, most folks, if they were growing dalo, were growing Chinese dalo, they weren't growing Hawaiian style dalo. So a lot of the stuff he talks about, he saw, but we don't have it anymore. He mentions that there are over 100 varieties of sweet potato, uala, for example. Right now, there's only 5. We don't know, and from his and a few of the descriptions, we know there were other varieties. That meant they had other flavors and stuff like that. But they're now gone. And if you're a modern farmer, and especially in a post-COVID Hawaii, having some of those other varieties would be killer because it would give you a real market segment you don't have. Same with dalo. There are over 250 types of dalo. Most of them are gone. I still remember when we used to work in the north part of Kauai, the 2 guys I knew up in Haina grow a pink variety of dalo up there, which is actually very slightly sweet. And you actually steam it, and you cut it into cubes and you fry it in a wok with raw sugar as sort of a dessert. Absolutely fantastic, but you can't get it anywhere. There's about 20 varieties of dalo still around. There's another 20 or 30 that people apparently have themselves. But all the rest of these varieties, which were all different in flavor, texture, and had all sorts of different, qualities, are completely gone. So his work was at a time when there was still enough of this stuff left you could actually ask people about and get information. But probably literally as he was writing this stuff up, the door was closing and that information was pretty much gone. So it's an incredibly useful resource. If you ever get involved in any sort of things related to plants here, it's like the must read, and copies tend to get worn out and everything. It's still available on Amazon, I'm sure. So, because we'll get into that when we get in today about the impacts of the Polynesians here. First off, I guess if there's no questions, notice this particular image, which hopefully you guys can see. I mentioned all the dryland stuff and sort of intricate nature of dryland systems here in Hawaii. The rainforest system is the one that's usually thought of when folks talk about Hawaiian forest. People almost invariably think of the wet forest or the rainforest. That again is a real sort of tricky concept. This particular image out of this whole, I just Googled the concept, and this is what a bunch of them popped up. This is probably the best example I can find of what if you want to call it pristine rainforest would look like. And I use that in a qualified sense because on one hand, we think of this as being sort of untouched, but the Hawaiians did use this extensively. There was a whole area in Hawaiian relationships, especially with folks in charge, i.e. the Ari'i, that would involve the catching of the feathers of birds. There was a whole genre of Hawaiian labor that involves specialized guys going into these high rainforest areas, catching the birds that lived up there and taking feathers off of them. Some of the species, especially of the the different finches, you can pull the feathers out in like the tail or under the, in some cases, for example, red feathers, there's only 6 feathers per bird, and each feather is about, I don't know, but maybe 10 millimeters long. So you catch the bird, pull the feathers out, let the bird go. Some of the other species, for example, the yellow feather, that's about the same. There's only about 10 per bird. When you catch the bird, the stress kills the bird. So on one hand, these look like they're untouched. On the other hand, they were heavily used by Hawaiians. So we have no idea how much all the human movement and stuff in this area changed it. But for our purposes now, we can just sort of say this is what's left of a pre-human Hawaiian environment. And the reason for this very simply is these areas were high enough elevation, they were wet enough that for one reason or another, people just didn't find them, they didn't have enough use to be worth the trouble of modifying. So when you look at this, one thing you notice if you look at this forest is, well, you can't really see it too well, but there's actually I can see 3 species of trees here. It looks like there's a kauila in the back, and I'm not sure what that is. And then the rest of these are largely ohia. So if you remember, I mentioned before that one of the aspects of Hawaiian vegetation, I should say in the sense of endemic vegetation, is its ability to cross over environmental zones. If you go to someplace like the mainland United States, when you change environmental zones, all the vegetation changes. It's like an entirely different place. It's got different types of trees, different types of grasses, etc. What you find in the Hawaiian system is some species are very specialized. Vili Vili, for example, is pretty specialized in zone. As I mentioned, on the other hand, others like some of the ferns and the ohia cross a number of zones. They just change the way that they grow and the way they operate if the conditions are different. So if you would, they're sort of like generalist and you know, in an environmental sense. So this is sort of what you see with a Hawaiian forest. Now, in a way, a dry forest would have been somewhat similar in its sort of lack of some types of diversity. One of the striking things about Hawaiian forest is you've got trees, of which there traditionally were about 8 or 9 different species that you'd find sort of mixed in with ohia usually being the dominant. And then what you're going to find is ground cover. Now, the thing that makes Hawaiian forest sort of hard for people to recognize is most of the ground cover isn't these large ferns. Most of the ground cover is going to be little tiny stuff. A huge proportion of the Hawaiian endemic environment was plants that you literally could fit in the palm of your hand. They'd be little tiny things with little flowers and all sorts of really bizarre, very strange plants that might be very specialized in place location. We think, for example, there are 2 species of plants that on the Big Island only lived literally on the ground next to ohia. We have no idea what that was about. But we think that's what their lifestyle was because they're pretty much completely gone now. So what you had on one hand was the generalist, like your main species. But what you also had was a huge number of highly specialized species that would vary not only in terms of environmental zone, but also location. Now, this endemic vegetation is sort of striking because there's one thing missing when you look at this that you tend to think of when you look at forests. This would include Asia, Europe, or the Americas. And that's the lack of any sort of grasses or bushes. The Hawaiian forest didn't have bushes. What we would call mid-level or low-tier vegetation is entirely absent. What you have is your main ground cover level or sort of basal layer is ferns. Underneath the ferns is, like I mentioned, this huge, very complex habitat, which has been very poorly studied. There's been a criminally small amount of work done on small plants in the Hawaiian forest. All the interest, ironically, has largely been in trees. And in part, I suspect, cynically, because 1, they're highly visible, 2, they're distinctive, and 3, in many cases, you can make money off of them. So the Hawaiian forest is pretty uninteresting. When you look at it, all you're going to see is a bunch of little tiny stuff that you have to be careful not to walk on. And then the rest of it's just going to be ferns anywhere from, you know, ground cover to up to 15 feet tall. That's basically replacing bushes. And then trees, you know, a little baby ohia here that's popped up, and a generally sort of a broken tree cover that's very, very mixed up. It's not very structured or organized. Now, that had survived and developed over hundreds of thousands, you know, probably over a couple of million years. The downside with this system is it doesn't have any large animals moving through it. The only thing you have in the Hawaiian system was birds. And most of the bird species didn't inhabit it. And the only thing you get up in these forests are basically things that are basically using the koa, the kauila, or the ohia in terms of like nectar and stuff, your finches. So there's basically no foot traffic in here. Now, when the Polynesians arrived, it's important to remember that, as I think I've mentioned, but we'll get into it more. When the Polynesians arrive, they bring in a whole repertoire of plants and animals with them. And these plants and animals are part of their Polynesian, what we call the Polynesian package. It's the Polynesian settlement package. And key with that is the Polynesian rat, which is a sort of Disney-looking thing that looks sort of like a cross between a guinea pig and a rat. And it's sort of roundish. It's stupid as a post. You used to be able to find lots of them over at Barber's Point, but I'm pretty sure they're probably gone with all the development over there. But they're still found in some of the Hawaiian Islands. They're not the rat in terms of the one you guys think of, the Norwegian rat. It's an entirely different species. In fact, I don't even think they can interbreed. So the Polynesian was brought in, Polynesian rat was brought in as a food source. The Polynesian dog, which is again almost entirely extinct, was brought in as a food source. And the pig and the chicken, all four were those. This was the repertoire of intentional Polynesian arrivals. The two of those, the dog and the chicken, really don't have an impact, especially on the wet forest. They're just not heavy enough, large enough, and they weren't, going to use this area. The Polynesian rat did. And again, I've seen almost no studies. It's really hard to even find pictures of Polynesian rats. And I haven't actually seen a live one in years. Like I said, we used to see them over at Barber's Point occasionally, near the airport. But the big player here, of course, is the Pacific Islands pig, which again is different than the pig you guys are familiar with, because the pig nowadays is a cross between the Pacific Islands pig and the peccaries, the small, really nasty ones brought in from Mexico in the 19th century. So when you bump into a pig today, it's only distantly related to what you'd find, for example, in Samoa or Fiji or the Western Pacific even today, which is the Polynesian pig. So these were domesticates. But you're always going to get escapees. The Polynesian pig, when they come into this area, find themselves basically in a version of heaven. Most of these ferns are edible to pigs. The trees aren't, but the ferns are. And they not only are good as a starch, but also in most cases, they also provide moisture. So the pigs basically graze through this area and destroy it. And especially the small plants, they just sort of consume them, from one end to the other. And the thing that all these areas have in common is everything you see here is very slow growing. This particular fern might take 10 to 25 years for this thing to grow. This ohia, this little baby one here, might be 10 to 20 years old. This ohia here might be a couple 100 years old. So on one hand, you have a forest, but on the other hand, it's a very, very slow growing forest, which of course, prior to human introduction of other species, didn't make any difference. I mean, what the hell difference does it make if it's a 20-year-old ohia and it's only 6 feet tall? Time can just take the time that it takes. There's no clock ticking. When you get the Polynesians bringing in the pig as a grazing animal, then all of a sudden this changes radically. Then, of course, you also have the Polynesians themselves harvesting the trees for canoes and for construction wood, etc. So when you're looking at all this, it's a complicated pattern of forest. So it sort of gives you an idea of how this actually played out. So the wet forest is a different environment than we saw on the dry sides, but it's equally complex in a different way. Let's stop that one. So when we're looking at this, these are regimes that we went through. Alpine zone, I'm not really going to mention too much. This is what you see on the high slopes. This is where the silver sword that we have here comes from, is these high zones, these frost zones, also largely ash, so there's very little soil. So that's a very specialized system, again, very unique and very fragile. Almost everything that grows in the alpine zone is now endangered, if not extinct. And again, the Hawaiians or the Polynesians didn't tend to use this zone. There was nothing up there that was worth exploiting, except, for example, mines for mining basalt for stone tools. So it's pretty much, largely out of sight, out of mind for Polynesian use. What you get starting in the early 19th century, because what we'll get into is the Polynesians bring in a whole mess of stuff. But the second sort of tier of exotics is the exotics that show up in the 19th century. And there's sort of two types of these that are really important to remember. One is the exotics that get brought in a very sort of calculated way for intentional use. And I mentioned this a little bit, I think, before. The keawe, the koahaole, the paperbark eucalyptus, all of these are brought in the 19th century in a very explicit way. The keawe, koahaole, and a lot of other plants were brought in to provide food for your new grazing animals, the sheep, the goats, the cattle, that I mentioned when we were looking at the dry landscapes last week. And so what you get is you get a whole set of plants that are brought in with purpose. In other words, you import them because you want to use them for something. Now, in a lot of cases, these, when you look at it in 2020, a lot of these uses were sort of mind-blowingly stupid. Lantana is probably the one I love to hate. You're probably familiar with lantana, a little flower, has a smell to it, sort of a spicy smell. And if you bump into it, it'll literally shred your skin, and it's actually got oils in the. And so what you've got is you've actually got oil in these things, so it'll be very hard for them to heal. If you get scratches from lantana, you can get them infected really easily. This was actually brought in as an ornamental, intentionally by the state when they're still a territory in the early 20th century, to provide a plant that would have pretty flowers that also, because of the thorns on it, wouldn't be eaten by the goats and the sheep, and therefore you could plant it on the sides of roads and it wouldn't get destroyed. So lantana was brought in for no other function than being pretty. Unfortunately, it's an absolute nightmare. If you go over to across the Poly, near the dump over there, there's whole areas of lantana where literally you can get stuck in there and you can't get out. It's up to 20 feet tall, and it's just this nightmare of nothing but thorns. So lantana is an example of something that was brought in for rather Manini reasons that have turned out to be a nightmare. Guava was brought in the same way. Guava was originally brought in as a sort of a supplementary foodstuff because the people liked the fruit. And of course, now it's just, it's all the different species are all over the place, like the strawberry guava, for example. Albizia, I don't think was brought in intentionally. I don't know. You'd have to check with Gail. She might know. Mangrove was not brought in intentionally. So this is your second set of exotics, which is exotics that are brought in for the, are not brought in. They just sort of are what you might call arrivals. They're hitchhikers. In the 19th and 20th century, hitchhiking largely was by virtue of shipping goods over. So you end up a lot of albizia, I believe, might be one of the ones that was brought over by the military unintentionally in military shipments from Asia. So what you get is your exotics come in two forms: intentional, and then also just by accident, I guess you might say. One of the side effects of this, and probably the strangest of these, if you actually go up our ridge up the top of St. Louis Heights, and you'll end up in the park up there, and you look around, you've got all the eucalyptus trees. This was one of the more striking aspects that I don't think people realize. If you go back and look at pictures of the early even into the 1920s here in the islands, for example, here in Oahu, you'll find that the upper slopes are largely deforested. There's almost nothing up there. The upper slopes would have had a version of that, the sort of ohia forest I showed you earlier. But that had been completely destroyed both by Polynesian use, but more importantly by European import of goats and sheep and stuff. So it's entirely gone. And so the upper slopes are largely in grasses and with panini cactus and stuff like that on them. By the late 19th century, which was actually really ahead of its time environmentally, even the monarchy was aware that the amount of water that was being captured in the hills, there was huge increases in flooding, and they were realizing that the amount of water that was actually available for people to drink was disappearing because you didn't have any tree cover. So they started planting trees in the upper slopes of the hills and mountains in the late 19th century, early 20th century. In fact, I think we might be one of the few places in the world that actually had a forester in the sense of someone who was in charge of making forest, even under, for example, Kalakaua monarchy. But right from the get-go, rather than using Hawaiian plants, for some reason they decided to use imported trees. So the monarchy, for example, on the lower slopes planted keawe. So you'd actually pay people to plant this stuff. They planted some other species, and they also imported a large number of species. When we look at the different arboretums here in Hawaii, the one in Manoa and the one in downtown, a lot of those arboretums were designed for the purpose of bringing in trees that would be used as ground cover or water catchment in the upper slopes. So they're bringing these things to see how they worked. By the early 20th century, with the territory, when we become a territory of the United States, this position continued and expanded because as the population grew, the concerns about lack of water were constantly increasing. With the 1920s, and especially with the Great Depression, we started what we call the Civilian Conservation Corps, where they were providing jobs for people because everyone was out of work. And so one of the things they did here is they had the Civilian Conservation Corps plant all the hillsides in the Hawaiian Islands in trees. So this is why when you stand on the campus and you look up slope, you see all these trees on the hillside, the ironwoods, the eucalyptus, even to a certain extent, in some cases the guava. All these trees are intentionally planted. So when you look at the hills and they're covered in trees, all those trees were put by someone climbing up that hill, poking a hole in the ground, putting a tree in the ground. But they never did any sort of planting with Hawaiian trees. So what they had done is basically you denuded the hillsides all the way up to about 3,000 feet by we'll just say 1850. By 1930, you've reforested and replanted all the hillsides and trees. So when you look at a modern Hawaiian forest, it's intentionally planted by humans in the last century for the purpose of water catchment. And this is why if you walk back in Pololo Valley, you see what you see back in the valley, among other things, coffee and all the rest of that stuff. A large part of that was planted by intent by the forestry department of what's now DLNR for the purpose of water catchment. Now, one of the weird side effects is there's two examples of this. Is one of the main ones, if you go out to Waianae, would be the macadamia nut. That was never imported to eat the nut. That was imported as one of these trees in the late 19th century, because if you're familiar with macadamia nuts, and I've bumped into them way too many times at Waianae, the whole tree is covered in these enormous thorns that are up to 2 inches long. And they're almost as hard as kiawe. And I know because I backed into one once. So the whole tree's covered in these enormous, very thick, very heavy thorns. And for the forestry guys, you have to remember that they wanted the trees to grow to catch water. So the last thing they wanted was people to be able to use the trees. So they intentionally tried to find the trees that no one would want to use, so they would stay to catch water. So one was the eucalyptus, which was pretty toxic to other plants. That had the advantage it cleared the area below it, which is why if you go up to our park up there, you notice there's not a lot of vegetation on the ground. But also no one could figure out a use for eucalyptus, so that people wouldn't cut them down and try to use them. And the other one was the macadamia nut. Both these are very hard woods, by the way. And I suppose the third would be, for example, the ironwood, which was the same thing. So what you do is you plant these things and you intentionally plant a useless tree because you want it to catch water. You don't want people to use the tree. So this is why if you go up in any of the valleys and any of the ridges here and any of the islands, you'll find yourselves in these mixed patterns of vegetation. They were intentionally planted by the monarchy, by the territory, by the state, up until basically the 60s and 70s. Then you suddenly get a switch and then people start to think, well, maybe we should plant Hawaiian trees. And you end up with an entire shift, somewhat of a shift. But even that ends up sort of complicated for a bunch of reasons. So when you look at exotics, on one hand, you have the exotics that have come in either intentionally or escapees or, just basically freeloaders. Then you also have very calculated moves on the part of government to basically plant the slopes and stuff. So this is why when you look at our mountains now, they're covered in green. That's an intentional result of governmental action. That's not, Mother Nature being Mother Nature. There's very little that's natural about it in any way, shape, or form. And it also means in that context, the traditional Hawaiian forest is pretty much nuked. The only section on Maui which has the largest piece of dry forest is an area of about maybe 2,000 acres above Makawao. That's entirely off limits to everyone. You can only go in with a permit. You have to go in by chopper. You're not allowed to walk in there. They're limited. You have to have, I think it takes 6 months to a year to get a permit. You're allowed in there for 4 hours. So that's one of them. Those rules are necessary just to keep it intact. There's a little tiny one over in the Big Island. There's a little one on the side of Mount Waialae on Kauai, which I think is now being destroyed by pigs. Somehow the fences came down. So their actual traditional wet forest is pretty much, you could probably fit all of it in on this campus almost. Not a little, well, a little larger, but not much. And there's no wet forest that's intact on Oahu. Okay, stop that one. Okay. Okay, let me, I don't remember, it seems to me I started on this and then hopped back. Did I talk at all about what the Polynesian impact here in this class? Because you and the 340 class are going side by side for a little while. Did I go over any of this first stuff, the change in the land systems with the Polynesians? Anyone remember? I don't. It doesn't sound like it. Okay. Okay, we'll assume that no one does. So when you get the Polynesian arrival, and again, you have to remember Polynesians have spent thousands of years moving from what is basically eastern coast of China, Fujian province, Hainan Island, etc., moving across the Western Pacific through what's now New Guinea and the Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, through into Fiji, and then eventually settling in Fiji and further east all the way over to Pitcairn and Rapa Nui and the Tuamotus Marquesas. In other words, all the way across this whole section. So they spent thousands of years moving across the tropical Pacific from west to east. And the one thing that you get as you move across that tropical section of the Pacific is that the climate conditions are the same. In a very almost systematic way, as you move from west to east, the islands get smaller. The amount of marine resources in terms of atolls remain the same. So the fish that you catch in Tahiti off the reef at Moarea would be exactly the same species of fish that you would catch off of Fiji on the reef, and pretty much the same species of fish that you would catch in the Solomons or in New Guinea off the reef. So your marine system remains remarkably consistent all the way across this tropical zone of the Pacific. The land system shrinks. So as you move east, because the land areas are smaller, because of some of these places, for example, getting to Fiji is about a 400-mile gap. From Fiji further east to Samoa is about a 350, 400-mile gap. So a lot of the species you see in the Western Pacific don't make the jump further east. So you lose your marsupials, for example, when you lose beyond New Guinea. You lose your large pigeons beyond the Solomons of Vanuatu. So what happens is the diversity of species shrinks as the islands get smaller and the distances get greater. A lot of them just don't make the trip or don't successfully reproduce once they make the trip. But having said that, everything you find in Tahiti is a subset of what you find in Samoa, which is a subset of what you find in Fiji, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the analogy I usually use is it'd be, if the Western Pacific would be Walmart or Target, the Eastern Pacific in terms of Polynesia would be a 7-Eleven. So everything in 7-Eleven you find at Walmart, but a lot of stuff that you find at Walmart you don't find in 7-Eleven because it's a lot smaller. There's not a lot of variety, et cetera, et cetera. So the Polynesians were used to this. They'd spent literally thousands of years. They knew all this area intimately. And for whatever set of reasons, is over time they move east. They're constantly moving east to take over these smaller islands and colonize them for a bunch of reasons that, you know, unless you have a time machine, we'll never know exactly why. But the key here is the commonality. So in that, what they had developed is a very sophisticated, very clever, and very efficient way to survive in that. As they moved east, they realized that these smaller islands would have the same climate as where they were coming from, but they wouldn't necessarily have the same plants. So what you get in the habit of doing is, if you're moving east as a family or a group, is you take the major plant systems, the plants and animals that you're used to, that you need, with you on the assumption that you're going to need to plant them when you get to this new location. So this is your coconut, your challah, your ulu, your breadfruit, your dalos, your yams, all this type of stuff. You package them and you wrap them very carefully in watertight or other types of containers. Even the coconut, for example, you bring little ones that have started to sprout, and then you wrap them up to make sure they don't get too damaged by salt. You also bring, for example, pregnant pigs. You bring a couple of chickens and a rooster. You bring a package of all this stuff, even a fairly small canoe. So when you end up in a new piece of real estate, you're not depending on what it's got. You brought everything you need. So you get out of the canoe, you let the animals loose, you immediately plant the plants, and within, you know, maybe 3 to 6 months, you should have the world that you left now reproduced in the world you moved to. So this is how Polynesians settled locations. They settled locations by bringing their world with them. And this worked fine. You know, it was a fantastic example. The first disaster would probably be, well, at the same time as Hawaii would be Rapa Nui, i.e. Easter Island, because that's a totally different climate and they totally got shafted there. But they ended up with a huge shock when they discovered and decided to settle the Hawaiian Islands, because we're not tropical, we're subtropical. So in that context, this entire raft of plants and animals that they brought with them suddenly found themselves in an environment that they were not familiar with and in many cases couldn't adapt to. Maybe 20–25% of the Polynesian package of plants that they bring up here don't survive at all. The swamp dahlias, for example, which are a major starch in the rest of Polynesia, they don't even grow here in Hawaii, unless maybe an arboretum might have them in a greenhouse. And some of the other species of yams and dalo just won't grow here. They can't handle the colder conditions. The different climates just leave them shocked, even in some place like Kaneohe, which we think of as being tropical. So what happens is the Polynesians arrive here, and they get out of the canoes and they do the standard thing. You let the animals go, you start to plant the plants. And of course, the scary thing is it's going to take 3 to 6 months to realize that things aren't working right. It's not like you just unpack it, or, you know, like heat up a tin of food or something like that. This is a longer term situation. When they land here and they look at, for example, that Hawaiian forest we saw in the image first, there's nothing in that Hawaiian forest that's edible. Even the ferns there, with the exception of the staghorn fir, you can't eat them. The starches will kill you. So they end up in this area that's covered in forest and it's got all sorts of different plants. And they suddenly realize that basically nothing in that environment has any utility in terms of food to people. And it's going to be 3 to 6 months. Yeah,
can I see you?
Oh, okay. And it's going to be 3 to 6 months before that food actually is available. And of course, you're not going to bring enough food on a canoe to actually, you know, keep a population going for a period of time like that. So what you find is that in that situation, then they immediately go to what always worked, and that's the marine system, the nearshore reef system, which was what their main food source was in times of emergency. And what they find is, again, the same thing. The marine biota here is extremely limited, both in terms of diversity compared to Polynesia, and also in terms of size. What you do have here tends to be smaller, with the exception of the pelagic species, which we'll get into later. So they find themselves in a world where basically the plants don't provide the food they're supposed to. The nearshore, i.e. the reef and stuff like that, don't provide as much as they're supposed to. And so what you do is you hit on the one thing you have left, and that's the basically endemic bird species. And there were roughly anywhere, as estimates are between 15 to 35 species of rail, which are birds found through all out the Pacific, and they fly fairly well, but they have a habit of, once they land on an island, if there's no predators,
You have a break?
they get
Okay.
heavy and fat, and they lose their ability
Do
to
you
fly.
need food?
So what you find is there's a number of species
Or do you
of rails
just
here.
want more eggs? Okay.
Like someone's got their mic on.
Give me 1 second.
And what you find is a number of species of these birds that are, the huge percentage of them are flightless. Rails invariably lay their eggs right on the ground. So what you find is that this becomes what the Polynesians largely hit. They hammer on these bird species to the extent that they extinct a lot of them fairly quickly, because they're in many cases just about the only source, especially the only protein source they have easy access to. So when the Polynesians arrive, they don't, you know, the modern Western stereotype, given this whole sort of idea of Polynesians being, you know, the children of Eden and at one with nature, etc. There's an idea that somehow the Polynesians arrive and live within the endemic world that they find. The reality is they were totally disinterested in the endemic biota. The Polynesian need was survival. Polynesians are incredibly practical as a population, and that's what they do here. So what they do is they basically very quickly start clearing areas to plant the plants that will grow. They start taking advantage and modifying the plants that did make the trip successfully, and they modify and use whatever other biotic systems, especially in the marine areas, as quickly as they can. So they absolutely hammer the bejesus out of, for example, the turtles. They do an absolute number on a lot of your marine fish and also dolphins and stuff in the nearshore environment, because they need the food. They also have no compunction destroying native plants in the sense of endemic plants if they're going to replace them with food plants. So by the time of Polynesian large-scale settlement of the Hawaiian Islands by maybe 1400, well, certainly by 1100, Basically, everything from 0 elevation up to about 3,000 feet has been entirely changed. Now, some species survive the change. For example, the alpaca and stuff do okay because they're not particularly useful, but the Polynesians aren't using that area for anything. Ohia and some other plants survive because they have utility. Other stuff, especially your smaller ground covers, they get wasted. So when people think of the Hawaiian environment, in the sense of the environment that existed prior to Europeans, they sort of think it as being the natural environment. It's not. It's a Polynesian intentional world that's been built through enormous amounts of effort and struggle over hundreds of years. This is what the Europeans saw when Cook and these guys arrive and they're walking on Kauai or walking on the Big Island looking at this stuff. They see the trees, they see the breadfruit, they see the dalo and the yams, they see all the stuff laid out in this landscape. And because of their stereotype that Polynesians live and eat, they think that that's the way this place was made, that somehow the dalo just showed up in what they called ponds, as if they were natural. Never mind the fact that there was enormous amounts of effort to make these things work. So when you're looking at the landscape that oftentimes people will talk about as if it's the Hawaiian, i.e. the natural landscape, it's not. It's no more natural than a farm in Iowa because it serves the exact same function. It's not the world that existed prior to people. It's the Polynesian / Hawaiian world that they modified this entire world into. And so we did, again, as I mentioned when I was talking about the dry forest areas, we don't really know what most of the Hawaiian environments actually looked like prior to people because the Polynesians / Hawaiians did such a good job of modifying these places to take massive advantage of them. That it's sort of striking. There's nothing in Palolo up till you get to Ka'au Crater that wasn't modified by Hawaiians. Everything in this valley, including this ridge, was entirely modified by Hawaiians. So when you talk about it, endemic is very different than the Hawaiian environment. They're two very different worlds. Okay, so it's always something to remember because oftentimes people get the two sort of mixed up. And they see them as like a package thing, as if, for example, the coconut and the breadfruit and the dalo and stuff were native to Hawaii. They're not. They're all imported from the south. Now, what also happens is two things. One is as you move into a place, one of the first things you do is you give it names. We call this toponymy in geography. And what that does is it gives you a link to the real estate. So rather than a landscape being sort of neutral, it'd be like if you move into a dorm room or something like that, you bring stuff of yours and you put it on the walls, you put stuff around to make it more yours, to give you sort of a temporary sense of ownership. When the Polynesians arrive here, one of the first things they do is they name most of the places that they notice around them. And in many cases, these are the same names that you find in Polynesia. So a lot of the place names are exactly here now, are exactly the same as you're going to find in Tahiti. There's a fair chunk that are the same as Samoa. And that's because your Polynesian arrival, they named all these places the same. So all throughout Polynesia, you see a lot of the same names for places. Kona, for example, is real common. So what you also get then is a second part of this. And this is probably the part that gets, I don't know, I guess maybe the most complicated. Did I go over clans in this class? I don't think so. Help someone, anyone? Does clan sound familiar, or is that something we haven't talked about?
I think we did.
Did we? Oh, okay, good, thanks. So in that situation, what you also do is you change your ownership. You don't only give things names. You give things you give names to places that are tied to ancestors. And so that gives the people that are related to that ancestor control and basically conceptual ownership of a place. So for example, the place names in Kahana traditionally all were tied to Kamapua, the pig god, because of course that's his property. The place names in Kaneohe were all tied to Kihavahine, like Kawai Nui, for example, a marsh, because that was her area and that was her place. So and the people that lived there were her children. So therefore, the places that they were named were tied to their ancestor, who was of course still around. And in naming those places, that gave them ownership of them. And of course, this is something that still goes on. We're one of the few spots I know of in the United States where if you're going to name a street, for example, you have to go through a Hawaiian naming commission because they very early, by the 1920s, they realized that all the place names were going to change and all the streets were going to change and the Hawaiian landscape would be completely gone. So you end up with a bunch of, in some cases, pretty goofy Hawaiian words for streets. But you don't have a lot of You don't have a lot of other ones. If you go to Kalihi, for example, you'll find there's like Republican Street, Democrat Street, etc. And those were sort of exceptions that were put in. But in most cases, street naming and place naming here is still tied to Hawaiian words, though they're not tied to clans anymore. But it still has to do with the idea of ownership. So then what you also get is you get your Ahupua'a system that comes in. So basically you now have a system of land control that goes from the reef break all the way up to whatever the high altitude area is, your Malcolm Makai, with this idea of basically a self-sustaining entity, i.e. the Ahupua'a, that a group of clans or a clan would live in, largely, you know, not in isolation, but pretty much that would be their world. That would be what they find in there. The key one for our purposes, and again, Handy does a really good job of talking about this in more detail than anyone else I know, is the fact that one problem that Polynesians have when they become Hawaiian is they never solve the problems of time and yield. All the plants you have that they bring up here come from originally the New Guinea area in the Western Pacific. And they've been there for millions of years, probably tens of millions of years. So your dalos, your yams and stuff like that are all, you know, midland tropical plants. And so you can bring them up in Hawaii, and in many cases you can grow them. But even after thousands of generations of you know, genetic modification, dalo here is still sort of a sad parallel to what you'd find in, say, Tahiti or Samoa or the Cook Islands or something. The dalos here take almost twice as long to grow. They don't grow near as large. And when they do grow and you pull them out of the ground, you realize that the corm, which is the starch you eat in the bottom and the root, is usually about 1/3 to 1/2, or in some cases 1/4 the size than what you would find in, say, for example, the same, you know, species or the same even, you know, subspecies in, say, the Marquesas or Tahiti or someplace. Yams even more so. Yams will grow here. There's about, you know, there's only about 5 species of yams still being grown here. But they don't grow particularly well here. And again, they take twice as long. Now, what this means in a very complicated way, if you're a Hawaiian farmer, you have to basically assume that anything you plant isn't going to be edible for roughly 9 months to a year later, which is a really long time. And on top of that, if you plant, say, you know, 200 square feet in yams, you're only going to get roughly 1/2 to 1/3 what you would in the rest of Polynesia. So you're not going to get very much food yield per, you know, square meter, relatively speaking. And on top of that, one of the downsides of Polynesian foods, and this is true in all of Polynesia, is that with one exception we'll get into later, they don't store. If your dalo has grown to fruition, you have roughly about a week and a half to harvest it. Or when you pull it out of the ground, the corm will have rotted. You end up with this really smelly mess, and there's nothing edible. So when these things, I guess the word might be fruit, when these things are ready to be picked, you have to pick them, and you pretty much have to eat them in a very short period of time. You can try to basically turn dalo into paste. You can do this with the yams too. But within we tried this a couple of times, and within a couple of weeks it ferments. And then it tastes like something that's been dead for a while. I don't think it'll actually kill you though. I mean, it's pretty sick. So pretty much you're limited. What you grow, you have to eat when it's ready to be eaten. So it means that if you're eating dalo right now, 6 months ago you planted, or 9 months ago you planted what you're eating today, which means that a week, well, if you plant it now, you're not going to eat that till nine months down the road. That also means that next week you will have to plant it another small area to eat that part 9 months and a week later. So you have this very long time with there's not a period of harvest, let's put it that way. So when people talk about the makahiki being harvest time, that's a Western concept. You don't have the idea of the grains coming in and you go and harvest the grain, whether it be rice or wheat or whatever. You then dry it and you can keep it for a couple of years, which was the original reason behind things like Thanksgiving. And especially Halloween in some ways. They were celebrations of the harvest season. In fact, the idea of a harvest moon was the moon so you could, the full moon so you could even harvest in the nighttime. So you could get all the grain in. And then you had food to last you through a whole winter, maybe a whole next year. In the Hawaiian system, you literally only had the food that you harvested that would last you for a couple of days to a week. And then you had to have other plants that were going to be ready to be harvested that next week. So Hawaiian farmers lived in a very, very complicated, very stressful world where you were constantly having to reproduce your farming system every week just so that you didn't starve to death. You literally could starve to death with a lot of food out in the fields that wasn't ready to be eaten yet. So you don't have the ability to store anything. There's no dry storage, there's no fridges, there's no nothing. You pretty much eat and then pick and then eat and then pick and then eat and then pick. And this is true in all of Polynesia, but for the Hawaiians, it was an absolute nightmare because it took a lot longer. You can grow emergency dalo in Tahiti that only takes 4 months. And it generates more in terms of the amount of starch than the Hawaiian ones do that take 9 months or a year. The large dalos that you find in Rotuma, where a friend of mine lives, are about this large. That same sort of, almost looks like the exact species, the same one in Hawaii is about the size somewhere between a softball and a golf ball. And it takes twice as long to grow. So for the amount of effort someone was going to put into it, they were going to get a lot less food. And this becomes real critical because it means, one, you basically have to plant everywhere that the stuff will grow because you're going to need it all. Because you're going to have to be sequentially planting a little piece each week, a little piece each week. Secondly is that your population is going to be largely controlled by the fact that you are very limited in your food resources. Because again, you remember that this environment did not give the human populations anything endemic to it. And your marine system was not that useful in many ways to what you, again, were used to in the past. Okay, let's do one. Now, the huge mystery in all this, and one of the assumptions that a couple of us make, which, just take it for what it might be, might not be, is that Hawaiian society, even more so than a lot of the rest of Polynesia, went through enormous amounts of change prior to European arrival. On one hand, the Europeans obviously made an enormous amount of very dramatic change here. But it's important to remember that was change stacking on other change. It wasn't like change was occurring in, where you had this very sort of static homeostasis system, and all of a sudden the Europeans come in and basically just boom, and just sort of destroy it or change it. From roughly the early 1500s on in Hawaii, especially starting originally in the Eastern Islands, enormous amounts of change hit the Hawaiian Islands. Now these changes are brought up by other Polynesians. So it's usually labeled the Paao religion or the Paao cult or whatever you want to call it. It's called the Adioi in Tahiti, which is where it comes from. This is an internally based movement. It starts in the Marquesas. A guy in the Marquesas, in Marquesas Islands, gets a vision from a god. It's a vision from the god Odo, who talks to him directly and gives him a set of directives, and basically says, in a modern context, Polynesians are living in sin. They've forgotten the words of the ancestors. So I've been sent down to basically remind you, this is the way you're supposed to do things. So when the Adioi religion starts with this Messiah, I guess for lack of a better term, someone actually, sees themselves talking to a god and becomes the voice of that god. This new religion comes in and starts in the Marquesas and very quickly spreads through Eastern Polynesia very, very quickly. We're not sure why it spread so quickly. Because you already had an existing religion. The existing religion was basically the religion of clan. For some reason, people buy into this new religion, they jump on board, and it becomes enormously popular and the dominant religious system in Eastern Polynesia. All the way through the societies, very quickly moves into Samoa and the Tonga. There it only stays for a little while and gets thrown back out, which is one reason that Tahitian society and Marquesan society now looks really radically different than Samoa and Tongan. That's probably a result in large part because of this Adioi religion. So these folks very much, among other things, have sort of a missionary way of looking at stuff. You just aren't a part of the religion. It's one of your jobs is to take the religion to folks that don't know it yet. So they're missionaries. A group of these missionaries sail from the Marquesas up here in the early 1500s and bring the new religion to the Hawaiian Islands. They set up shop in Puna in the Big Island. They built a heiau, a religious site called Va'aula, which was there till it got just swallowed up in lava in, I think, the 1990s. I don't know. We did a bunch of work there in the 1970s. That's all I remember. And the religion, again, becomes very popular here. But at least initially, it's only popular in the Eastern Islands. So this new religion is called, here it's called Paao. Now we don't know Paao. Paao isn't a word that you hear prior to that. So we don't know if that meant that if that was the name they gave themselves in terms of this new religion, if that was the name of a person. It's usually, at least in the oral traditions, it's given as the name of somebody. But it might also have been a religious position. Maybe that was the equivalent, like a cardinal or a bishop or a missionary, I don't know, or priest. So Paao is the new religion that comes in starting the Big Island. Now, like I said, the major mystery is we don't know why people here embrace the new religion. They already had an existing religion tied to land, i.e. the clan. But for some reason, at least on the Big Island, it becomes enormously popular again really, really quickly. There's some argument, because the timing is sort of suspect, that when this new religion shows up, it's also when you see the arrival of the sweet potato. There's been a fair amount of work just done in the last 5 years on this finally, which is way overdue. If you go back to this traditional Hawaiian vegetation system, or I should say the Polynesian vegetation system, as I mentioned, the problem with all these plants is originally from a tropical environment. And what that means is they grow very well in very specific conditions. So it's like, you know, if you're going to grow this plant, you need to have this constant temperature, this amount of water, this amount of sunlight. As long as you do it the way it's happy, then it's fine. But they're pretty much what you might consider like prima donnas. The minute you change something, they're all upset and they get all pissed off and they go into a pout, which means they don't grow very well. Hundreds of years of genetic modification by Hawaiians didn't really change that too much. I mean, they got more food and it grows better now than it did back then. But it's never been a real success. Breadfruit, for example, with outside of Lahaina, has pretty much always been a disaster here. So what happens is a group of Polynesians, as far as we can tell, sail to South America, which again, they would have done. I mean, these guys were running all over the place all the time, and apparently bring back with them sweet potato, which is ualo. Now, sweet potato is an absolutely fascinating plant. If you're here in Kaimuki, for example, and Pololo, it's the plant of choice if you're going to eat food. It's in South America. You see this all the way down to basically near shore conditions, basically a strand vegetation, and it grows all the way up to about 5,000 to 6,000 feet. So you can go way up in the Andes Mountains and people are still growing sweet potatoes. It grows in areas covered in ice. It grows in near desert conditions. It even grows in tropical conditions. So unlike the prima donna Polynesian foods, the sweet potato pretty much grows everywhere, all the time, anytime, any way, shape, and how. Like its Polynesian counterparts, you can eat the whole thing. Every part of a sweet potato can be eaten. It's all edible. It's all very good for you. So in that regard, it's very much like a dalo, in the sense that it's you know, you get to eat the whole thing. This arrives in Polynesia right about the same time, if not a little earlier than the new religion. And one of the potentials is that if the new religion had this magic crop with it, then they might have been able to argue that, you know, their God gave them this as proof, you know, something. I don't know. We don't know. But there must have been some reason that people were leveraged to buy into a new religion. One of the things about sweet potato is that it grows very, very fast and has very high yields. So, for example, where campus is, had no utility in the Hawaiian system. You couldn't grow anything here. It was too dry, you know, just wasn't useful. When sweet potato comes in, the farmers very quickly realize when they bring it up here, is that if you make little piles of rocks, and you literally would just collect rocks, make a little pile about, you know, about a half meter high, half meter wide. You take some of the cut off ends of the sweet potato, throw some mulch, you know, old grass or whatever in the middle of the pile, stick the sweet potatoes in the pile, cover them with a few light rocks, and then walk away. And within 3 to 6 weeks, you're going to have sweet potatoes covering the entire pile. And within 2 to 3 months, you're going to have a whole pile of sweet potatoes deep. And then you just take the tops, cut them back off, stick them back in the pile, and you start all over again. So what you ended up was in Polynesia, but especially here and also in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is this becomes the magic food. Sweet potato completely revolutionizes agriculture and food production in the Hawaiian Islands. Because this side of the island, the dry side of the island, Pololo would have only had agriculture in the wet fields, i.e. right along the stream in the middle of the valley here, would have had food. But I would be willing to bet you probably had maybe no more than 50 people living in the valley because the food production is so limited. Especially because you have to remember, it takes a fair amount of area if you're going to have to sit there and grow little bits every week. Among other things, it's easier to, sweet potato stays as long as you dry it, you know, in open areas. You can keep it basically safe for about 4 to 5 months. So you can store sweet potato for a longer period. Most importantly, it only takes us half or a third as long to grow. You get more yield per plant, a huge amount more, maybe 3 to 4 times more per plant. It takes no physical effort. You know, when I was used to live in a little place in Kaimuki, you literally could just stick a hole in the ground, stick a sweet potato in, and the sucker would just grow. Didn't have to do any weeding. It's so aggressive the weeds won't hassle it. You know, and you've got food for no effort. You don't have to build a wet field. You don't have to do anything for it. It's just pop. It's like magic. So what that meant is all of a sudden the Hawaiians could now use the dry sides of the islands. So if you remember last time I was showing that little bit of the vili trees, they very quickly realized that, oh, there's not enough rain on that side of the island, even with the mist, for the sweet potato to grow well in the open areas. But if you plant it underneath the vili trees, they're happy campers. The vili tree likes it because the vines of the sweet potato cover the land and basically cover the ground and make it a little cooler, which makes it more efficient. The vili trades that off by the moisture coming down the trunk. So the sweet potato vines go up the side of the trunk and go out along the side of that. And so you end up with this very, very effective, very advantageous system for the Hawaiians, that you can now live in the dry parts of the islands because you can take that dry forest and you can actually use that as basically almost like a water catchment system for the sweet potato. Didn't work with the other stuff. You needed the sweet potato. With sweet potato, all of a sudden the population just goes lump here in the Hawaiian Islands. And with that population increase includes a bunch of other sort of complex things. So sweet potato was the revolutionary crop here in Hawaii. Not so much in the rest of Polynesia because they already had official food crops, but especially if you go to someplace like Aotearoa in New Zealand, again, as with here, but even more so. Most of those the islands, the North and South Islands, were largely uninhabitable for the Maori till the sweet potato comes in and all of a sudden, wham, now you've got this enormous amount of food and not surprisingly, huge increases in population. So we'll stop with that because there might be a relationship between that and the new religion. We don't know, and you'd have to go back in time to probably find it. But at least here in the Hawaiian Islands, the sweet potato appears to show up slightly about the same time, if not slightly earlier, maybe the same time as this new religion shows up from the south. So we'll stop with that. Any questions about all that stuff? Everyone's really quiet today. That was true yesterday too. No questions, no concerns. Okay. Since that seems to be it, I guess.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
For the project, picking our project roles, that
Yeah.
assignment, have we done that yet or not yet?
Well, I have to have from you what you want to do. Yeah, do
Okay.
that. If you haven't, do it. Because I have to do the detailed part. That's actually on my list for things today, this afternoon. Then I'm going to tell people what specifics, and if I can, I'll give people choices. In other cases, I'm just going to have to tell them what to do. So
Okay.
yeah, so if you have something you want to do, be sure you say it. Otherwise, I'm just going to pick something for you.
Okay, are you gonna like put out a document with all the things?
I did already.
Oh, okay.
Should be
Thank
if
you.
you go to the Canvas in the first section, there should
Okay.
be a document up there, which is the sort of the Pololo project. Which
Okay,
has them
thank
in there,
you.
yeah. Anything else? We're all set? Okay, I guess in that point, then I'll see you Friday, same time, same place. Okay, see you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.